People, let me present to you AbdulMu'min bin Ali Al-Ghoumi. Ghoumi. Interesting name. AbdulMu'min Al-Ghoumi. He is de facto maybe the word founder isn't really accurate, but he is the key figure in Islamic history who establishes the Mohad Dynasty, which in Arabic is the Muwahhidin dynasty. They were one of the most powerful industries. Industries. What am I saying? Dynasties in Islam, and in its heyday, ruled over the largest region that any dynasty. I suppose maybe the early Umayyad could be excluding them. But generally, especially in later Islam, that any dynasty ruled over. So they ruled much more than this in their heyday. In the map there that you can see, this was in the early Mohad dynasty. So what happens later on, they move further north and they conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula, that is most of Spain and all of Portugal and most of Spain. And Africa, they go further south so as to incorporate a third of the African continent. And you can see this here was their flag, that kind of checkered board that you can see. Yeah, there you go. It's an inspiration for either they love playing chess. And that's some designs from the time of the Mohad dynasty. They were an immensely powerful and incredibly affluent dynasty, and so really known for their kind of military strength. The Mohad, the Muwahhidin, Allah, the people of Tawheed, because they began with Muhammad ibn Tumurt, who was the Mahdi. He claimed to be the Mahdi, a Messiah, and he was fed up with the Moravid dynasty or the Moravid. They spell it as V, but the V and B in Spanish is the same. But or in Arabic, the Morabitin. They were fed up with the Morabitin, and Al-Mahdi ibn Tumurt, he kind of preached, and he was considered maybe a madman by many, but then he got his believers, as people do, and he started to tell them, and he got his special elite, kind of special select people, and told them and gave them all these promises and said they were there to establish the kingdom of God. And he tried, and he miserably failed. Doesn't sound very good when you say it like that. But the man tried. Karna parta hai. You know, and he was the caliph of the Morabitin actually had him arrested on a particular occasion. You know, it just goes to show, sometimes you have it right there in your hand. Pata nahi lagta yaar. You know, you don't know what you're in possession of. So he actually had him, and he said, that what shall we do with him? And they said that execute him, the Mahdi. This is what they told the caliph. And the caliph looked at him and he said, why? He said, do you really see any threat from him? All the while, Mahdi ibn Tumurt, he said in the words of Rajkumar that Hum tum nahi, hum aap hai. That so he let him go. The caliph of the Morabitin, he said he had him imprisoned, and they told him, look, the viziers advised, the ministers, they said that execute him. Better safe than sorry. When in doubt, just kill. When in doubt, put out. So there you go. So they said, look, just to be on the safe side, execute him. And he looked at him and he said, well, this is just a madman. What could a madman possibly do against the might of a dynasty? Allah, Allah, Allah. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامِ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. You see, Allah says, but those days, we circulate them amongst people. So at times, a person can become deluded. So they let him go, and he did. He rallied a little crew, and then it got a bit bigger, and then he had a troop, you could say like a brigade, and they tried to attack Marrakesh. Marrakesh was the capital for. It was made by the Murabitine, the Murabit dynasty. So they tried to attack it, and obviously they failed miserably, and they tried again, and then he tried to recruit more members to his it was a borderline cult, because they believed him to be the Messiah, the Mahdi, and many of them lost their lives, and the Mahdi himself almost got killed in battle. Eventually he does get injured, and then he retreats, and then he fails in his attempt. He never sees the success that his words had set into motion. You see, but I tell you, have you guys heard of the Pygmalion effect? In case you say Mufti doesn't share psychology with you. See, the Pygmalion effect is an effect that it's like a fulfilling prophecy, that you treat somebody in accordance with an aptitude, a capability, and then they perform in accordance to that expectation. So a coach let's say he treats a particular player, let's say a football coach or whatever, I don't know, or whatever sport, he treats a member with a certain expectation that, oh, come on, you can do better than that. And then that member performs in accordance to the expectation. So this is seen as the Pygmalion effect. And it can be called like a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. And this is what happens. You see, along comes this individual. So they spell it P-Y, Pygmalion, not pig as in pig, P-I-G, but P-Y-G, Pygmalion effect. So, yes, thank you. Somebody wrote it out here. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Scope. Right, so along comes Mahdi. Was a Berber, by the way, but the Murabitin were also Berber. They were Berbers as well. Along comes this individual from this tribe. His name is AbdulMu'min ibn Ali. Young man, nothing special, he's not a luminary, he's not from any elite. In fact, he is a young man, capable, but nothing special about him. But he catches the eye of Mahdi ibn Tumart. In his first encounter with Ibn Tumart, the Mahdi says to him, he looks at him and he asks him, what's your name, boy? Or what's your name, young man? And he says, AbdulMu'min. And he just kind of glances straight into his eyes. And he tells him that Allah has written greatness for you. He says that at your hands, great civilizations will crumble. And he says, and at your knees, dynasties will collapse in front of you. These words of the Mahdi ibn Tumurt struck so powerfully into the psyche of AbdulMu'min that he went on to conquer the Murabit dynasty and establish an empire of his own that would not only span over a century, but become one of the most powerful empires in human civilization in its age. AbdulMu'min ibn Ali takes that so much to heart that once the Mahdi passes away, he kind of wages this relentless campaign where he refuses to give up. And in a sudden turn of the tide, this new cult gains the upper hand and conquers Marrakesh. And the moment they conquer Marrakesh, the capital, the rest of the cities and towns collapse to them. And he goes on, and they were obviously fighters. There's no doubt about that. But it's this belief that he had in himself. And it's amazing how these beliefs are instilled by words that are no short of magic. Wallahi. When people speak of magic, I was speaking on my Discord group, my Patreon Discord group the other day, and I was saying that take a look at Elon Musk. He sends a tweet with a few words, and they change the face of current economics. How is this not what the ancients would have called magic? By uttering a few words. You see, in the past, somebody would believe I say hocus pocus or I say a magic spell and this happens. And here is a man who I personally am in awe of as well, Elon Musk, who sends a tweet with a few words and the entire crypto market trembles. Wow. The power of words, people. AbdulMu'min ibn Ali was somebody like that as well. And the Mahdi, however weird some of his beliefs were, he was a man whose words struck powerfully when he chose them to. And the reason I was mentioning AbdulMu'min ibn Ali was he sets up this great empire, but he sets it in accordance with the belief of the Mahdi. So one of the things they do is the world that they conquer was mainly Maliki in fiqh. So what they do is they launch this attack against Maliki fiqh because they say that Maliki fiqh is a deviation. And the Mahdi said, we reject all these schools of law and we only go by the Quran was Sunnah. Nice claim, but it was from the Messiah, the Mahdi at the time. And so they reject all these schools of law. And he was also very surprisingly, the Mahdi Mahdi ibn Tumurt was incredibly Ash'ari. So he imposed Ash'ari Aqidah. Now, so this becomes the trend, and this becomes the kind of constitution that no judges, Maliki judges, are allowed to teach or preach Maliki fiqh, and no judge can rule by Maliki fiqh, and we must get rid of these books. So what happens is this dynasty now passes from after AbdulMu'min ruled for around 30 years, I believe. He has a very incredibly powerful reign. After him, it's his child Yusuf, who is also quite anti-fiqh. And then his child Yaqub, known as Yaqub al-Mansur, who made Rabat in Morocco today. Rabat al-Fath was a city created by Yaqub al-Mansur. So, and those of you that know the Qutbiyya in Marrakesh, today, that was built in his time, Yaqub al-Mansur, and that's why they have, and he had the same in Seville. So Seville was the Iberian capital. So in Spain, it was Seville, Ishbiliya, and in Africa, it was Marrakesh. So, and you had the same tower built in both. Now, in Yaqub al-Mansur's time, he also commanded that we get rid of all of Maliki fiqh books. He reinforced that doctrine, and we burn. In fact, we get rid and burn. And but to be fair to Yaqub al-Mansur, he was incredibly, he was an enlightened individual and was not dogmatic at his core. So even though he began with the tradition of his ancestors in saying we believe in the Mahdi and we do this and we do that, but he was open to reason. And as he started to engage with scholars, they showed him that, and he saw that his ways were wrong, like they didn't add up. So he actually changed the beliefs. He was the first of the Mohad, the Muwahhideen, to remove the Mahdi belief from the dynasty and say we no longer endorse the Mahdi, we no longer endorse that he was ma'soom, infallible. We don't even, in fact, he removed the Mahdi-ness entirely from the dynasty. And he was very pro-philosophy. In fact, he's the one who meets Ibn Rushd and has that debate and discussion with him, and he was very open. And he later on became very comfortable with Maliki fiqh coming back, even though it wasn't formally instated, but he kind of turned a blind eye and allowed it, despite in his early days saying that we should burn the books. And I'll tell you, this is, and it ties in incredibly with our Salah segment, that you see, in his early days, you know, when, Josh, youthfulness, you know, when the power of youth, he's like, he would say, burn all the Maliki fiqh books. Who are these people? So what they do is in one of his gatherings, I think it may have been in Seville, he rounds up the scholars, the great scholars, and the caliph comes, Yaqub al-Mansur, Allah, in all his haiba and awe. The king, humble yourself in the presence, Allah, of his majesty. And the wazir, the minister, first stands up and he gives a khutbah. And he says that what is this? He says that they continue to preach these books of the Malikiyya and the this and the that, and they have been outlawed. And they continue to teach this madhab and all this kind of stuff. And he gives this kind of speech. And then Yaqub al-Mansur rises. Hum hai, hum tum nahi, hum aap hai. So he stands and he says, it reaches me that they say that in the kitab, that they have a book they refer to as Al-Kitab. And anybody who knows Maliki fiqh knows what Al-Kitab is. Al-Kitab is the Mudawwana of the Fatawa of Imam Malik. We call it Al-Kitab. It's referred to in the books, they say in Al-Kitab. He says that they say that we find that it is said in Al-Kitab. He says, what is Al-Kitab, the book? What is this, the book? The book. The book. What is this one? He says, what is this, the book? He says that they say that in the book, it says if a person is praying and something happens to his prayer, let him repeat it in the time. As in, if the time is gone, then he doesn't have to repeat it if he remembers out of the time. But in the time, if he recalls, he should repeat it. He says, what is this nonsense? He says, there is no book, Al-Kitab, except Kitab Allah. Allah, what a dialogue though. What a quote. And he says if the salah is either valid or it is invalid. He says if it is valid, then there's no need to repeat it. And if it is invalid, they must always repeat it. Where did they get this nonsense from? And he said, burn these books. So all of these scholars are standing there in silence. Nobody's daring to nobody dares to kind of speak. So there was a Maliki legend by the name of Ibn Zarqun. Allah, legend of his time from Seville in Spain. And he says, Hamalatni al-ghayra. He says, I couldn't take it anymore. I can't take it, man. This one too personal, He says, I couldn't take it anymore. And this Ibn Zarqun is the same person who has a commentary on the Muwatta where he combines Al-Baji and the Istidhkar of Ibn Abdul Barr in one book called the Anwar. So this Ibn Zarqun legend, he says, if I have permission to speak. So Yaqub looks at him, thinks, he says, go on then, what? He says to him that, look, con permiso, if you allow me, ijazat ho to. He says that this issue that you speak of, its evidence is in the Sunnah. He says there is a hadith in the Sahih that a man came to the masjid and prayed in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when he finished, the Prophet said, Qum wa salli fa innaka lam tusalli. Stand and pray again because you did not pray properly. He says the person repeated it and the Prophet said again, Qum wa salli fa innaka lam tusalli. And this happens, a very famous hadith, by the way, in which the Prophet repeats it about 3 times. And then he says to the Prophet, I don't know, teach me how to pray. And the Prophet says, when you stand, do this. When you go into ruku, do this. And the Prophet outlines the prayer. He says the Prophet only commanded him to repeat the prayer of the time, al-waqtiyah, did not tell him to repeat all his gone prayers. Allah! This struck Mansur like a thunderbolt. Because this attitude of we get rid of the madhabs, get rid of fiqh, we don't need the madhabs. This kind of empty claim that we go by Quran wa Sunnah, and as though the school of Medina didn't. And just because you don't know the evidences, to assume that they don't have evidences, it struck him like a thunderbolt. So he kind of just dropped his head and he just left. And they say it's after that he advised his ministers that leave them alone. Like if they want to practice and teach Maliki fiqh, let them do it. And so this then became a turning point in the entire Mohad dynasty. And this is the time where people like Ibn Rushd were alive, and Ibn Zarqun and Ibn Abil Jadd and all these great scholars. But I thought I'd share that story with you because it was incredibly interesting that you've got this Salah point, you've got these caliphs, you've got this, and also this arrogance of thinking that when scholars come up with rulings, that they don't know what they're talking about just because it doesn't appear to you by saying that the Malikis say, oh, you only repeat the prayer of the time if something went wrong in it. But let's say you didn't, let's say something went wrong in yesterday's prayer, but then you forgot and today you remembered about it. It's not necessary to repeat it. So now that sounds, because in a black and white world, people say, well, either the prayer is wrong or it's right. If it's wrong, then you should always repeat it. But yet these scholars, Imam Malik built that ruling upon knowledge. Alimahu man alim wa jahilahu man jahil. Whosoever knows it, knows it. Whosoever doesn't, doesn't. I thought I'd share that with you It was an incredible story. I love these kind of stories. You know, when I read them, I kind of get all I'm like, whoa, I get really kind of drawn into it. All right, so let's move on. Mufti, would this be covered in your Al-Andalus from Rise to Fall? I don't know if this story is covered in there. I can't remember now. I have to redo that series because it's been so long. I see Saracen, you're doing it. Much love for the super chat, right? So what's your view on the 11th century Spanish knight Rodrigo Diaz El Cid? Was he pro-Muslim or anti-Muslim? El Cid, which comes from the Arabic word, is a known character or personality, which comes from the Arabic word Sayyid, El Sayyid, because the Arabs, especially the Moroccans, they would, the North Africans, they would, or the Moors, they don't say Sayyid often, they would just say Sid. So even today they say Sidi, as opposed to saying Sayyidi. So El Cid was El Sayyid. And he was like a client knight, if you like. He was, I mean, he was for hire. He was a mercenary that you could hire, and I don't think he was against Islam. Some people claim he may have even been Muslim. I don't know. I don't think it's clearly stated. There are some arguments. It's been years now. I watched something where there was some speculation that he may have been Muslim, but it's possible. But he seems to be an independent figure that was he was available for hire. If you want to hire him, he was a mercenary. I mean, he was a very good warrior, and so he had his own kind of little crew, that, you know, this kind of army. And Muslims, at times he fought alongside Muslims, at times he fought against Muslims, sometimes he fought alongside Christians, sometimes against Christians. So that's yeah.